I gave you an account of possible causes of his death. There are many. According to Perdiccas, who will figure quite largely in the next few years after his death, Alexander uttered two last famous remarks, and these may be completely apocryphal and serving Perdiccas's purposes, but he was asked to whom he left his kingdom. Since he had no obvious heir, this was an urgent question, and Alexander replied supposedly to the strongest. And then he also declared, and these were his last recorded words, that all, quote, all, well, quoting in English seems a bit odd, but, quote, all his foremost friends would hold a great funeral contest over him. And as you might know, Mary Renault wrote a trilogy about Alexander, and Funeral Games was the title of the last volume. So this was actually, even if this was invented, it was a pretty shrewd assessment, because waiting in Babylon was a group of tough, battle-scarred, ambitious Macedonian commanders. Their eyes were fixed on the glittering prizes of empire, and their ideals were a good deal more mundane than Alexander's own. Not for them in any form the fusion of East and West. When Alexander was dead, they repudiated, almost to a man, the Iranian wives wished on them in that bizarre mass marriage ceremony at Susa. And when I read about this, I thought of the Reverend Moon, if you recall, who used to conduct mass marriage ceremonies. But Alexander did that too. And it wasn't for them, the generals, the Persian court protocol, the high flow plans to change the shape of the world. You can just imagine what the generals said amongst themselves while Alexander was alive, as you know, what they really thought when they were deep in their cups, what they really thought about what Alexander was up to. But anyway, the very fact of their Macedonian background, with all that this implied, was to prove a major determining factor in all that followed. Macedonia had always been, and to a great extent remained, an ambiguous frontier element of the Balkans. Macedonia formed, as it were, a buffer enclave between the Thessalians, those from Thessaly in northern Greece, and their Hellenism was never in doubt, and a range of variously hostile and dubiously civilized tribes, such as the Epirotes, where Alexander's mother Olympias came from, but they weren't Greek, and the Illyrians, occupying present-day Albania. Nobody really knows much about the Illyrians, actually. But as we said in the presentations on Alexander, at least since the early 5th century, the lowland royal house of the Agiads, and that's based on Agos, that's the dynasty that Philip and Alexander were part of. And Argos was a Greek city in the south, in the Peloponnese. It had been at some, the Agiad dynasty had been at some pains to establish its Greek identity in a cultural, no less than an ethnic sense. The aristocrats of the ruling family all spoke Greek quite well, and nobody really knows what Macedonian was, but it was probably a kind of Greek. Yet, basically, Macedonian society remained in essence anti-Greek, a rough and vigorous monarchy ruling by main force over ambitious barons whose chief interests in life were fighting and drinking. Southern Greeks never lost an opportunity of sneering at Macedonian barbarisms, nor Macedonians at Greek effeteness. It sounds like blue and red to some extent. As mentioned, Alexander left no designated heir, but he had a Bactrian wife, Roxanne. Bactria was modern-day northern Afghanistan, and she was Iranian. Bactrians were kind of Iranians. Roxanne was already 6 months pregnant. Alexander also had a half-brother, Philip Arrhidaeus, who was also in his 30s, as Alexander was, but this son of King Philip and a Thessalian mother was half-witted. That's the term that most historians use, and it seems sort of un-PC now. But he may have had epilepsy, but in any event, whatever he had, nobody took him seriously as a royal contender. Alexander also had a full sister, Cleopatra, who was the daughter of Olympias, who was also Alexander's mother. She could not rule by herself in Macedon. That was the role. It's interesting, in Epirus, a woman could rule, but in Macedon, she couldn't. But that meant that she could become a very desirable marriage prospect for those vying for control of the empire, as we shall see. Unfortunately, all three of them, Arrhidaeus of Cleopatra and Roxanne, all ended up dead fairly quickly. So as you can see, already there were the makings of a stupendous struggle. They had conquered a lot of territory. They had become immensely wealthy. There was no obvious heir, and that's just a recipe for, and you had very warlike people involved. That's a recipe for general warfare, and that's exactly what happened. And also, the unborn baby, even if it did come out as a boy, which was a requirement, and this is Roxanne's baby, it would be half barbarian because Roxanne was Bactrian, and that's the Greek term, barbarian. And it would need and like Arrhidaeus, because he was mentally challenged in some way, it would need guardians to exercise real power in its name. And that's a big opportunity for the commanders, in particular Perdiccas. But ironically, the disintegration of everything began with Roxanne. 5 months pregnant in a strange country, she had come with Alexander to Babylon on the way back to, actually, it's an interesting question whether Alexander ever wanted to go back to Macedonia, but she was in Babylon with him. She had heard that Alexander's Persian wife, Shtera, daughter of Darius III, who the great king who Alexander had defeated, she was also pregnant, and she was in Susa. She had probably also heard Ptolemy's remark, and I'll get back to him later. He's a major player among the generals. She had probably also heard Ptolemy's remark that her own child, even if male, would be half slave, and that no Macedonian would want to submit to him. Shtera, on the other hand, was the daughter of a great king, even though not Greek, not Macedonian. She, aristocrats respect aristocrats, no matter where they come from. Her status would be higher than Roxanne's. So Roxanne, this according to both Plutarch and Diodorus Siculus, two of the major sources for the whole period, Roxanne wrote a letter to Shtera. She wrote a letter in Alexander's hand using Alexander's seal, inviting her to Babylon. When Shtera arrived with his sister, Dripatus, who was Hephaestion's widow, Hephaestion's being Alexander's great friend, commander of the companions, the elite cavalry, and also undoubtedly Alexander's lover, Roxanne offered them both a cup of poisoned wine, and this is a theme that's going to be repeated. Both were dead before night.
Hey, John.
Yes.
John, quick question. I don't know if the slides are advancing, but we only see the first
no, I'll
slide.
do it. No, it's a mistake of mine, but it's only the map, and it's not. This is the introduction, actually. So,
sorry to interrupt. I apologize.
Yeah, I was aware of it. I just didn't want to disturb. But this is the map is the state of the empire at Alexander's death. Just to give you an idea of the extent. Anyway, to go back to what I was saying, Roxanne kills Dripatus. That's an odd name. She just pops in and pops out immediately. I should say this period is fiendishly complex, so I have simplified somewhat to give you an idea of the major developments and themes and players, but there's a lot underneath the surface you could go on for 24 hours about, and it's only 50 years too. So in this early period after Alexander's death, the chief men would be Ptolemy, a Macedonian, of course, who was rumored to be a natural-born son of old Philip himself, father of Alexander. Antigonus, one of Alexander's trusted generals, Lysimicus, one of his companions on the Indian campaign, and Perdiccas, who had served as commander of cavalry, a very important position, the companions. And essentially, he was after Hephaestion died, who preceded him as commander of the companions. He was effectively the second in command after Alexander, so he dominated in this initial period. The first struggle about the Macedonian commanders was for who would be the guardian of the royal line. These were all apparently invented titles, but you had to make these generals happy with their titles. But which line was it going to be? From 330 BC onwards, young Alexander had practiced the inclusion of Persians and other Iranians into positions of honor around him, and eventually even into the inner world conquering units of his Macedonian army. He had married the Bactrian Roxanne. He had loved the eunuch Bagoas. He won't play a role here, but Mary Renault wrote a fascinating novel about him, the second in the series. Alexander had actually had 30,000 Iranian boys trained in Macedonian weaponry and entitled them his successors. In addition to the forced marriages of his senior commanders, he had given presents to no less than 10,000 of his troops who had already married Asian women too. This inclusion had gone way beyond a mere recruitment into supporting units so as to keep up his army's manpower. It put barbarians into the great companion cavalry and made a few of them companion nobles. You can see what this is going to cause is the older Macedonians are going to be extremely resentful of this large number of foreigners coming into not just as cannon fodder, as phalanx fodder, but as people who could be power players in whatever came. So this was a principle that Alexander just pursued. He just, he saw himself as building a world empire. Remember, he thought the world ended soon after, not far from the eastern edge of his empire. And as I said, some of the older Macedonians really, really hated the policy. They had no wish to fraternize with people they had once tried to kill. As soon as Alexander was dead, this hatred erupted. And as I pointed out, this is full extent of the empire at its greatest. It wouldn't last for very long, mainly because of lack of planning by Alexander and some foolish moves. Let me go on. Oops.
John,
Now this, yes, question?
yeah, the map is great, and it shows that they didn't get into Crete or Cyprus. Do you
No.
have any idea why? Because I mean, they look like a great place to stop by at least.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, the whole Alexander launched the invasion of Persia to destroy the Persian Empire, and that implies Eastern momentum. And when he had destroyed Darius, he just kept going east. As I noticed from my sources, Alexander did have a sort of legalistic interpretation of his depredations, of his conquests. He thought since he had defeated Darius, he was the lawful king of the Persian Empire, so he just moved to consolidate control over the whole empire, which is what you're seeing here. And Cyprus wasn't part of that. If he had lived, he probably would have moved west, towards what is now Spain. But we'll never know. But that's the only thing I can think of. It just wasn't on the agenda at the moment. But I will say Ptolemy did attack and occupy Cyprus later on. As part of it when he got his kingdom in Egypt as one of the generals. He did, I believe, take over Cyprus as part of that. But it's so complex, so there's so much in the 50 years following Alexander, and you'll see a little bit of it, there was just so much. It's like all the commanders were just jostling each other all the time. And I have further maps to show how that happened. They were just fighting each other all the time over the borders, and it makes for a very complicated situation. But anyway, this is from the Alexander Romance, a medieval portrayal of Alexander handing his king over to Perdiccas in the middle there, and he's receiving the royal ring. It all looks very apocryphal, but that's what the story is. So what happened is, at Babylon, the senior commanders met to decide the future. The empire needed a king before the news of Alexander's death spread through all those hard-conquered lands. There was no CNN, so it would take several weeks or months for everybody to hear. That's an interesting question. The Greeks rose up right away, and I'll get into it down the road, but none of the Iranian peoples rose up. It was remarkably quiet. But immediately there was a split at this meeting. The younger ones, mostly cavalry, were willing to wait for Roxanne's unborn son. They didn't really care that she was Iranian. The older Macedonians and the veteran infantry and the cavalry were pro-Roxanne and her child. The older Macedonians and the veteran infantry, they agitated for a Macedonian heir, a son of King Philip, even if he was mentally unsound. And there were riots, and it was followed by a compromise. Things weren't so bad yet. They came up with an agreement which came to be called the Partition of Babylon. Excuse me for making this into a lecture, but this is really quite a complex story. So we have to get, we have to get through a lot of elements fast. I'm trying to pull out the most prominent themes in it to make it a coherent picture. But they came up with an agreement which came to be called the Partition of Babylon. I guess that's a modern term. I don't know what the ancients called it. A compromise was reached under which Perdiccas, who had risen, as I said, to replace Hephaestion, he was to serve as, quote, regent of the empire and supreme commander of the imperial army. He clearly had the standing to take that job because he had been Alexander's second in command. Arrhidaeus, that's Alexander's brother, and the unborn child of Alexander's wife, Roxana, and his title was to be Alexander IV, if he managed to be born successfully in male. They were recognized as joint kings. The general Craterus, who was another senior general, was officially declared guardian of the royal family. I don't quite know what. I think he was in charge of taking when they brought Roxanne and the kid back to Macedonia. He was the one who oversaw that. He had official security control of the royal family. Perdiccas effectively was regent, as the joint kings, both of them, both Roxanne and Arrhidaeus, were in Babylon with him. But unfortunately, Perdiccas soon showed himself intolerant of any rivals, and acting in the name of the two kings, he sought to hold the empire together under his own hand. Perdiccas's authority as regent and his control over the royal family were immediately challenged. Perdiccas appointed Leonatus, one of Alexander's bodyguards, and that wasn't a low-level job, as we might imagine. It wasn't like the Secret Service. These were high-level positions occupied by nobles. Perdiccas appointed Leonatus as satrap, and it's interesting, the Macedonians, after they maintained the Persian title for provincial governor and didn't give it up for a while. He appointed Leonatus as satrap of Hellas Pontine Phrygia on the western coast of Asia Minor. That's Turkey today. However, instead of assuming that position, Leonatus got a bit beyond his skis. He sailed to Macedonia, and Alexander's sister, Cleopatra, who was widow of King Alexander I of Epirus, remember Alexander the Great and Cleopatra. Cleopatra was a daughter of Olympias, just as Alexander was a son. They were brother and sister. Cleopatra offered her hand to Leonatus. Why she did that, the sources don't say. But upon learning of this, and this was clearly Leonatus was planning to become number one. Upon learning of this in spring 322, a year or so after Alexander died, Perdiccas marched the imperial army towards Asia Minor, Anatolia, today's Turkey, to reassert his dominance as regent. Perdiccas ordered Leonatus to appear before him to stand trial for disobedience. But Leonatus died. Actually, there's one thing I won't cover today. The Greeks rose immediately after the southern Greeks, the Athenians and a couple of other city-states. They rose immediately when they heard they were not particularly fond of Alexander. But they rose immediately, and Antipater, who was the regent in Macedonia and Greece, who had been appointed by Alexander, he's another senior general. Leonatus joined him in putting it down, but he actually died in combat against the Greeks. But the Greeks lost completely. They did not regain their freedom, and they really don't play a large part in the big story. So at around the same time, another half-sister of Alexander, please be sympathetic with me, another half-sister of Alexander, Sinane, I guess, arranged for her daughter Eurydice II to marry the joint king Arrhidaeus, the mentally challenged one. And Arrhidaeus, by the way, would have taken the throne name would have been Philip III, because Alexander's father was Philip II. Fearful of Cynane's influence, Perdiccas ordered his brother Alcitas to murder her. The discontent expressed by the army at the plan to murder her, they were horrified. How they found out about it, I don't know, but they did. And they had great respect for Eurydice as a member of the royal family. They persuaded Perdiccas not only to spare her life, but to approve of the marriage to Philip III. As you can see, the members of the royal family are just being pushed and pulled everywhere, and it's not going to be good for their health. Despite the marriage of Eurydice to Philip III, Perdiccas continued to firmly hold control over the affairs of the royal family. As regent and commander-in-chief, Perdiccas saw it as important that he consolidate Alexander's empire. A key step in achieving this was to conquer Cappadocia. That was a region in northeastern Anatolia. And he wanted to conquer it because it still remained under Persian rule. However, another general, Antigonus One-Eyed, Monophthalmus, who was a very interesting character, Antigonus One-Eyed, he was the Macedonian satrap of Pamphylia and Lycia. Those are provinces in Anatolia again, Asia Minor. He was unwilling to support Perdiccas when in 322, Perdiccas successfully invaded Cappadocia. When Perdiccas ordered Antigonus to appear before his court, because Antigonus had disobeyed him, Antigonus fled to Antipater's court in Macedonia. And as I said before, Antipater had been appointed by Alexander the Great to rule Macedonia in his absence. So you see the jockeying with each other, the alliances are shifting and depending on circumstance. And that will be the case for the next 50 years, unfortunately. So to strengthen his control, you may have been unhappy to select this topic. It's really I'm trying to make it as clear as I can. And it's quite simplified, actually. To strengthen his control over the empire, Perdiccas agreed to marry Nicaea, the daughter of the satrap of Macedonia, Antipater. That's trying to pry Antipater apart from Antigonus, as you can see. However, he broke off the engagement in 322 BC when Olympias, she hasn't gone away yet, Olympias, mother of Alexander the Great, offered him the hand of Alexander's full sister Cleopatra. Cleopatra had offered herself to Leonidas, and now Olympias offers her to Perdiccas, which at one point the daughter gets the choice, another point Olympias, her mother, gets the choice. But anyway, given the intellectual disability of Philip III and the limited acceptance of the boy, Alexander IV, since his mother was Persian, the marriage, if it had gone through, would have given Perdiccas a claim as Alexander's true successor by being married to Alexander's sister, not merely as regent. Now, one of the interesting developments in this whole period of the Diadochi, the successors, is going to be women take a really large role in the whole mess, and they unfortunately don't come to a good end. But they were major players, actually, in a male-dominated world. Now, this is an interesting. After the partition of Babylon, everybody got all the powerful people got their own little slice of the pie. And I thought this was a very good image. This was the distribution of the satrapies as a result of that meeting in Babylon, the partition of Babylon in 323 BC, is just they just sliced it up. And as you can see, Perdiccas's name is not mentioned. I won't go through this map in detail. It's pretty readable. Perdiccas basically exercised. He had control over, where was my, looking for my pointer here. Ah, I got it. Oops. Perdiccas dominated in the east. You see, this is these were two native rulers. They let them keep Taxiles, if you remember from the earliest presentations, and Poros. They got to keep control of their provinces. But everything blue and kind of turquoise were being dominated by Perdiccas. Ptolemy got Egypt, a very wealthy area, so he may have been, despite Perdiccas having the geographical size here, Ptolemy may have been the lucky one because he got the wealth. Egypt was a very vital agricultural center at the time. And Antipater and Craterus got Macedonia and Greece. And there was Lysimicus up in Thrace. All this is going to change around over the next 50 years quite a bit. And you can see Leonidas is here, except he's dead by now. Antigonus is there. Eumenes, another general. He was interesting. He was one of the few pure Greeks who sort of managed to get into Alexander's inner circle of power. Aristotle may have been Alexander's tutor, but Eumenes actually was a player. They only, like the Romans, they only let, correct me if I'm wrong, but I can't think, like the Romans, the Greeks could be intellectuals, but they couldn't actually exercise power in their circles. But Eumenes was a...
there were a number of Greek commanders. Nearchos is another one.
Oh, thank you.
Right. So there were a few Greeks who were, you know, who had military roles, and different of the successors had more or less trust in them. So Antigonus, you know, was more in favor of delegating power to Greeks than some of the others.
Okay, I made a generalization there that was unwarranted.
Is Eumenes the one who got Pergamon later on? Is that the same Eumenes?
I did not see that.
No, that's a different. It's a different dynasty. They have the same names, Eumenes, but this Eumenes is Eumenes of Cardia, and the people who ruled Pergamum had different roots.
Okay.
Because Eumenes was for first Philip's and Alexander's secretary, so he actually got military experience quite late at the beginning in India, so he didn't really show that much military potential until actually after Alexander's death. It's kind of interesting.
So most of the conflicts is about the Perdiccas.
The Pergamene dynasty was established by a guy named Phileteros, who I think was actually a eunuch and had to get nephews to be his heirs.
All right, John.
Okay,
very interesting.
Oh, good. I hope it's a lot of names here.
I like it very much.
Oh, thank you. Okay, well, as you can tell, splintering everything. Oh, I should reemphasize, Perdiccas did not take a satrapy officially, but he had political control over the individuals in the East for the most part. So over the next few decades, there was going to be quite a winnowing of these people, because it ends up as, you know, in depending on how you count, as 3 or 4 separate kingdoms. This way of dividing the empire was a direct path to war. As Rufus, who was a Roman historian of the 1st century, he says, men who had recently been subjects of the kind of the king had individually seized control of huge kingdoms, ostensibly as administrators of an empire belonging to another, and any prefix for conflict was removed because since they all belonged to the same race, but it was difficult to remain satisfied with what the opportunity of the moment had brought them. Remember, this meant a lot. This was a big chunk of the wealth of the known world. It was difficult to remain satisfied with what the opportunity of the moment had brought them. Neither shared race nor their shared loyalty to Alexander could stave off the inevitable drama. The wars of the successors broke out almost at once. Okay, well, Roxanne had her baby, and it proved to be a boy, and Perdiccas's power rose consequently. This was the infant Alexander IV of Macedonia. As I said, Egypt had the potential to be the greatest military power of all the satrapies. Ptolemy marched very quickly to take charge of Egypt. He marched with only 2,000 men, but when word spread that he was offering generous pay, Greek mercenaries flocked to him. When his strength was great enough, Ptolemy made his intentions clear by kidnapping Alexander's body, which had been bound. Perdiccas had sent it back to Macedonia, to his hometown. It had been bound for Macedonia, and but Ptolemy stole it, or acquired it, and he buried it in Egypt as though Alexander had been his ancestor, which would make him a candidate for the overall kingship, obviously. Perdiccas knew that this was a move for control of the empire. He assembled his army and marched down to fight against Ptolemy. The attack was a disaster. I mean, you think Perdiccas was the big guy at the moment. He was definitely going to win, but his attack on Ptolemy was a disaster. I won't go into, there may be 20 battles in this period, so I will not go into this in any detail, but it did not work out well for Perdiccas. After the retreat, and very bad, it was curtains out for Perdiccas. His officers saw the light, that they would have to make deals with Ptolemy. Perdiccas's officers banded together, led by an officer, Seleucus, whose name will become very famous very soon. He had been with Alexander Seleucus had been with Alexander when Alexander visited Egypt before his death. These officers banded together and assassinated Perdiccas. End of Perdiccas, even though he first out of the gate, he looked like he was going to be the winner. And but as we shall see, Seleucus will be quite successful. He's going to get assassinated too, but after he achieves success, Seleucus will be successful in this Hunger Games competition, which is what it is. I mean, so one general was now off the scene, the preeminent one. Ptolemy ordered both Philip and the baby Alexander IV removed from Babylon and taken back to Macedonia, where they would be under the protection of Antipater. And remember, he was the regent left behind by Alexander. He rewarded Seleucus, which may have been something of a mistake, because as Ptolemy rewarded Seleucus, who had gotten rid of Perdiccas, by giving him Babylon to rule. It has a comic element to it, this whole thing. These people are incredibly savage. So, oops. So this is a picture of, this is a character I haven't introduced yet, but this is Cassandra and Olympias. Cassandra is going to do Olympias in soon. So you can think of this as scenes, and we just did scene 1. This is scene 2. In 319, 4 years after Alexander's death, Antipater died. He left Macedonia not to his son Cassander, who already had Caria, that's a province in a satrapy in Anatolia. He left Macedonia not to his son Cassander, but to another Macedonia. That's another thread in this, which I won't go into, who that other Macedonian was. So both Ptolemy and Antigonus got together with Cassander. Cassander was obviously very annoyed that his father, turfed him out of his legacy. But Ptolemy and Antigonus got together with Cassander to undermine Antipater, and so they agreed to help him capture his father's territory. But this is where fierce old Olympias, Alexander's mother, she's still very much alive, of course. She had her grandson Alexander IV brought to her own house at Pella, the royal capital of Macedonia, along with his mother Roxanne. And it just interests me as somebody interested in languages. How did that? Interpreters are not mentioned in the sources, so how did they communicate? And I should point out that she's identified. She didn't speak Persian or any of the modern languages. They think she spoke Old Iranian, and her name would have been pronounced Rakshna or something like that natively, and it means shining, radiant, or brilliant. She has become, I should say, just as an aside, as you all know, she's become one of the most famous people in all of Alexander's career. There's many, many paintings of her. But anyway, Olympias was with Roxanne and the child was Olympias's grandmother. she rounded up supporters of her own to fight for control of Macedonia. Cassander, along with Cassander's victory would have meant the establishment of a new royal house, and Olympias was too accustomed to being the mother to watch that happen. Okay, Olympias was not successful in this. She did not keep off the three powerful satraps for long. But before they overran Macedonia, she did manage to get her hands on the feeble-minded. Remember, that's a leitmotif here. I shouldn't say feeble-minded, the mentally challenged Philip Arrhidaeus, full brother of Alexander. She had always hated him. Must be half-brother. Who was Philip Arrhidaeus the son of? Anybody know? Who was his? Anyway, Olympias had a low opinion of Arrhidaeus. She had always hated him, and she loathed the idea that he would be co-king with her grandson. She had Philip stabbed to death before Cassander and you can't feel sympathy for any of these people, actually. She had Philip stabbed to death before Cassander and her allies could arrive to rescue him. When Cassander did make it into Pella in 316, he arrested Olympias and ordered her stoned to death for murder. And that happened. He put Roxanne and young Alexander, now 9, under house arrest, theoretically for their own safety, and we'll see what happens with that, in a castle in Amphipolis overlooking the Strymon River. That is in Macedonia somewhere. Now, and this becomes a countdown very much. And as you can see, that's a picture of Cassander, imaginary picture of a Cassander on the left, pointing out Olympias, and Olympias is appealing to that statue of Alexander on the right. It looks very French, this picture. Now, the map has shaken itself out into 5 kingdoms. You have Cassander in Macedonia, Lysimicus in Thrace, Antigonus one-eyed. He presumably lost the other in battle, just like Philip had lost an eye. Alexander's father had lost an eye. Antigonus one eye is in Asia Minor. Seleucus controls Babylon and the Persian heartland, and Ptolemy is in Egypt. And it shrinks even further as we go on. And obviously, there are other players on the scene, Laomedon and Syria, et cetera, et cetera. The main reason for selection here, who I have decided not to discuss and who I'm discussing, is it's only the relatively, the ones who have some chance of success who remain on the stage for a while. Most of the rest just disappear from the commanders without, they aren't relevant to the big political picture. Anyway, so up in Macedonia, in the castle in a castle in Amphipolis, the fate Roxanne, remember she had poisoned somebody else who escapes me. I just said it, but the fate Roxanne had feared ever since her husband's death came upon her. Sometime around 310, the cup of wine at dinner had poison in it, and both Roxanne and Alexander IV died. And Alexander was only 12 years old, around the same age that his father had been at the taming of Bucephalus, Alexander's horse. Now, undoubtedly, Cassander, who was acting as king of Macedonia, was the culprit, though I don't know if that's beyond, it makes the most sense. He had the motive and the means and the opportunity. He was undoubtedly the culprit. The other 4, and now this is very interesting, the other 4 generals knew exactly what had happened. Obviously, they had intelligence services, though we don't hear anything about that. But for the next half decade, no one spoke of it. No one named himself king. No one abandoned the title of satrap. They all supported what they knew to be a lie, that young Alexander was still alive in the fortress on the Macedonian River, and that they were all serving in his name. None of the 5 was willing to be the first to claim the title of king. Why? You might think this was loyalty to the memory of Alexander, that they were not members of his family. No, the actual reason is that whoever took it first would find the other 4 allied against him. So they were playing, it was a you first kind of game, and it would result in political disaster and death for whoever made the first move. But that is essentially what happened. And here you see another imaginary picture of Roxanne. I just threw this in here. It's Roxanne and Alexander with all the putti around him. It looks like Baroque or something. Oops. But what happened next? Scene 4. This is a coin of Antigonus with this, with his head here. And on the back of it, on the reverse, it says of the king Antigonus. And this is the first use of basileus, that's the word for king, after Alexander, because Antigonus was the first one to break the balance. And he did this only after two victories. And strangely enough, the victories were achieved by his son Demetrius, who will become a major player after Antigonus's death. But the victories were achieved by his son. Because of them, Antigonus clearly demonstrated that he was the most powerful of the 5. The first of these victories was an invasion of Athens in 307, which we won't talk about much. We'll just say Cassander, the son of Antipater. These father-son relationships are crucial. If you think of the following period, and this is how I thought through it, Antigonus and Demetrius are versus Antipater and Cassander. Those are the 2 power centers. But Demetrius invaded Athens in 307. Cassander, like Antipater before him, had been not only king of Macedonia, but also the overlord of Greece. Demetrius marched into Athens and drove Cassander's men out of the city. And then, for the second victory, he directed a naval battle against Ptolemy had jumped in, but Demetrius directed a naval battle against Ptolemy's ships, which took place at Salamis, interestingly enough. The Ptolemaic fleet was defeated. So this made Antigonus, father of Demetrius, look really, really strong. So after this, Antigonus took the title of king. So Lysimicus, who's still sort of resting on his heels up there in Thrace, he gets more active later on. Lysimachus, still in Thrace, and Seleucus in Babylon, decided not to anger the one-eyed monster, if I can call him that. Rather than allying against him, they began to call themselves kings as well. So they didn't dispute his right to call himself king, they just took the title themselves. And Ptolemy and Cassander did as well. So the death of Alexander IV, though nobody ever said as much, was now taken for granted. He was no longer a player, or considered as one. So I thought this was a nice picture. So after this, in the next 15 or 20 years, this plays out over time, all 5 kings then began, one way of looking, they began to jostle at each other's borders, a process that reached its climax at the Battle of Ipsis in 301 BC. That's 22 years after Alexander died. Ptolemy, whose power was concentrated in the south in Egypt, sat it out, but Cassander and Lysimachus fought against Antigonus in an engagement which remained undecided. See, Antigonus looks like the strong guy here. So Cassander, Lysimachus, and Seleucus team up against him, with Ptolemy staying out for whatever reason. So Cassander and Lysimachus fight against Antigonus in an engagement which is undecided until Seleucus arrives from Babylon, which is an overwhelming force, and he throws his weight onto the side of, they're called the allies, Lysimachus and Cassander. Now, Antigonus is 80 years old at the time, and according to one of my sources, he was grossly fat and really, really loud. He had a booming voice, but he was still on the battlefield at this point, at 80. Antigonus was 80 years old. He fought until he died. And the only battle I'll be discussing in detail is this one. I'll do it at the end about what actually happened on the battlefield. But this is part of the political narrative. So I'm just giving us a thumbnail here. Antigonus fought until he died. He died from several javelin hits. His troops were scattered. His son Demetrius fled to Greece. We're not done with Demetrius yet, by the way. His son Demetrius fled to Greece and set himself up as king there, abandoning the Asia Minor. Antigonus has held land in Western Asia Minor, but he his son Demetrius gave the land up. Lysimachus took the western part of Asia Minor for his own. Lysimachus was in Thrace, so he just moved east into Asia Minor. You see all the borders are sort of shifting, shape-shifting. Seleucus took most of the rest. Cassander, who had done what's funny is Cassander, who had done the dirty work of getting rid of Alexander IV, got very little out of all of this, Ipsis. He added almost no land to Macedonia. So 5 kings still remain: Ptolemy, Lysimachus, Cassander, Seleucus, and Demetrius. Their borders had shifted, however. Now, Ipsis was the most significant of the entire period, and as I said, we'll discuss it further. It epitomized the realities of successor politics. As soon as one successor emerged that's potentially the sole ruler like Antigonus, the others would all gang up on him, thus preventing the reunification of Alexander's empire. In hindsight, Ipsis, if Antigonus had won at Ipsis, he would have become overall emperor, king, whatever you call them. But he lost, and this was, in hindsight, this was the last chance for Alexander's empire to cohere as a unit. This was really the end. It was destined to break up at this point.
John,
yes.
Ask a question. So, to my recollection, all these generals that were in forefront, the Cassander and all this generals who were in forefront, ended up being in periphery, and people like Ptolemy moved up front. How was it that all the ones that were close to Alexander and then were able to grab the most or did the most ended up being in periphery and were pushed aside by the smaller generals through conning? What was happening in general?
Well, in the case of Seleucus, he just, was the ones who won the battle. Perdiccas had looked like a big leader, and he had the standing. He was second in command to Alexander when Alexander was alive, but he just lost the battle badly. It comes down to military prowess and good fortune, and we don't know much about the personal relations. At least I don't see much, I don't think the specialists know much about it either, as to, personalities dominate each other. And to what extent that played a role is very unclear. A very junior person can become very dominant very quickly if the senior leader has ill health or is just, their personality is weak. We don't know much about that. But I would say it's fundamental military success. Does anybody have any other ideas?
Some of it was kind of luck, because like one of the major ones, Craterus, who was basically had a good chunk of the senior infantry, just died in battle. I think he died in battle with Eumenes, which wasn't expected completely, right? Like
these people like Alexander, they always fought in the line, in the front line, and that was a recipe for eliminating generals. After the Julius Caesar fought right behind the front line, but he wasn't the guy leading the charge. So their style of warfare played a part too.
Some of them got killed. Like Eumenes killed a few. Craterus, I think he killed another one, and then you mentioned one of them died in Greece. Eumenes when he went to help Antipater. So like 3 or 4 of them just died in battle basically in the first couple of years.
Yeah, it was a high risk.
I think it's hard to generalize about, this is like an overall thing. In my reading, the sense that I get is that Antipater was old. I mean, there's a big generational aspect to this, right? So Antipater, who was elderly, was much less likely to be rambunctious and expansionist than the others. And it seemed like his main objective was to maintain the position of the Argead dynasty and to have the other generals as satraps give essentially lip service allegiance, but to acknowledge the superiority of the Macedonian dynasty, even though they were more or less independent. And that his plan was essentially that Craterus would be his guy in Asia. Then Craterus gets himself killed, and then Antigonus kind of steps up to be the guy to take care of Asia. The successors in general were very happy to get the royal family out of Asia and to Greece, get them at some distance so that they could have a hands free to expand what they were doing in their own area. That's then as you say, a lot of them just died. I'm going to say one thing about Lysimicus. Lysimicus was not sitting on his hands in Thrace. Lysimicus got what was kind of like the dirtiest job of all of the major generals, which was to basically fight a war against the Thracian tribes to prevent them from coalescing into a significant country. And that was a really difficult task. And Lysimachus had a reputation as being a military genius for many of the things he did, but it was for fighting on many different fronts, vastly outnumbered, and so forth and so on.
I would say I just tend to speak, hopefully, in an amusing way. Later on, Lysimachus had the problem of dealing with the Gaulish, the Celtic invasions, which I won't go into great detail, but he managed to handle that, and he did manage as well to take over Macedonia and Greece, but that's later on, and maintain Thrace at the same time. So I just said that because, well, all this action was going on and he wasn't involved. So
yeah, so
I may have overstated that somewhat.
when John said that somebody was a member of the bodyguard, that should be understood. That was the highest possible position that you could have if you were not a direct member of the royal family. Yeah. Right? So you had the companions, which were the Hetauri, but the bodyguard was a subgroup within the companions, much smaller, and those were the people that had 24/7 access to the king. They were the real elite. So they were, so Lysimachus wasn't a second-rank guy. And Antigonus was not a second-rank guy either. He had been left behind in Phrygia because when Alexander was rushing to the east, he didn't really bother to subdue it very thoroughly. So he had to leave somebody behind who was really competent, which was Antigonus, but he was another. So these were really, first line players, A-list celebrities, if you will.
Yeah.
Seleucus, they were all people who were present at the Babylonian, at the Babylon division of the empire, except for Antipater.
Yes. Oh, well, shall we continue? That's Ipsis for now. I'll come back to it to discuss the actual battle and the tactics and everything, because they're of interest, of great interest, actually. Okay, let's step back for a minute and think about what, all the native peoples who have been conquered, and they're looking at all this strife going on amongst their overlords. But what is, I mentioned it before, what's most remarkable is during all of this intra-Macedonian mayhem, none of the people in Asia ever rose in rebellion. Asian recruits even continued to serve copiously in the Macedonians' own competing armies. Why were there no national revolts? One thing is, at first, Alexander reappointed the Iranian governors who surrendered to him. A wise move. In his absence in India, some of them had revolted, but other Iranians had even helped to capture them. By Iranian, I mean Persia writ large. I think it's a cultural and a linguistic group. Persia is only one piece of the Iranian cultural sphere, and the Iranian cultural sphere extends into Afghanistan, as it does today. Actually, as these are all related languages. There is unfortunately no overall sense of identity at this time, and there isn't now. But in any way, Iranians were cooperating with the Greeks, with the Macedonians. As I said, there was no national solidarity among the people. And unfortunately, the Macedonians had the monopoly of trained military force. Perceptions of Alexander's conquest also varied according to class. I don't know if that's the right word, but where you were in society. For many of their subjects, the Macedonians' victory had meant very little change. Tribute continued to be demanded. Local collectors still gathered it. Even when land was given to new beneficiaries, it still had to be worked by the same local workers. Why then revolt for more of the same under a new or old name? I mean, that seems the easiest explanation. People may welcome the conqueror more than the current regime. But for whatever reason, nobody ever rose up. Unlike, as I said, the Greeks, they rose up immediately. But anyway.
In particular, in the East, Alexander had started establishing garrisons and leaving large numbers of veterans behind. So
Yeah.
there were Greek rulers in Bactria and in these eastern provinces, and they actually managed to maintain their rule for like 200 years.
Yeah, the
So that was
Bactria
a very
lasted a long
successful
time.
policy.
And
So
there was,
and specific reason that he did that was to suppress revolts, because there were constant revolts while Alexander was there himself, and he kept on having to go back. So that's when he realized how important it was to establish garrisons and colonies, and that really pacified the East very effectively.
Well, it's interesting. I think one of the first revolts Perdiccas faced was some of those veterans wanting to go home. So I think like about 10 or 20,000 of them decided to like leave Bactria and wanted to go back to Macedon. I'm pretty sure they were eventually massacred because he didn't want them falling into the wrong hands.
okay, let's move on. This was something I hadn't known. Seleucus, while he was fighting with the other successors, he had an eastern front in the form of Chandra Gupta of the emergent Mauryan Empire of India. He decided to carry on negotiations with Chandra Gupta. Chandra Gupta had come to power sometime right before Alexander's death, sometime between 325 and 321, in his own small kingdom of Maurya, which is over. The map doesn't match my my talk very well, but his home base is somewhere over here. Not long after his accession, he had turned to make war on the last Nanda king of Magadha, which is also over here. But the main point is Chandra Gupta was immensely successful. So, and this is from a slightly later period, 250 BC, but his empire basically comprised modern India and Pakistan, except for the deep south. So Chandra Gupta, like any emperor, he wanted to extend his own reach beyond the Ganges. If you recall, the Greeks had made it basically to the Indus here. Their control stopped here, and this is where the Indians began. Chandra Gupta wanted this area back. Chandra Gupta proposed a bargain, and this is very interesting. It's going to be very consequential historically. He would give Seleucus 500 war elephants if Seleucus would yield the Indian territories to him, and that's modern-day Pakistan. It's sort of India in the British Empire sense of what's today Pakistan and India, but it's modern-day Pakistan. Seleucus, he would yield the Indian territories to him if Chandra Gupta would give him 500 war elements. Seleucus, powerful though he was, realized he would not be able to defend both the far eastern and far western borders of his kingdom. He agreed, and that had a deep effect on the Battle of Isthmus, actually, as we shall see. Elephants won the war for the allies over Antigonus. Okay. So who is this? Demetrius of Macedon. This is the seventh scene in our little comedy. In that same year, Demetrius took Macedonia. Cassandra of Macedonia had died the year before. Remember, Demetrius is overlord of Greece. Remember, after Islip, his father was killed. He went to Greece, took it over. But Cassandra of Macedonia died soon after. And then Demetrius, I should say, Cassandra's sons made a big mistake. They fought over the succession. I should say one of them made a big mistake. They fought over the succession to Cassandra until one of them appealed to Demetrius. That's inviting the fox into the henhouse. One of them appealed to Demetrius down in Greece for help. This was a mistake. Demetrius campaigned northwards, drove out both of Cassandra's heirs, and added Macedonia to Greece. The 5 kings had become 4. This is Demetrius, by the way. I don't know if it's authentic, but who cares? The 5 kings had become 4: Ptolemy, Lysimicus, Seleucus, and Demetrius in his father's Antigonus's place in Macedonia and Greece. Now, unfortunately, this was a temporary victory for Demetrius. It's really head-spinning, this whole thing. A face, a certain Pyrrhus appeared, grandson of the king of Epirus, whose kingdom Philip II, father of Alexander, who had absorbed decades before. Remember, he married Olympias and Epirote. Pyrrhus was the son of Olympias's brother. Remember, Olympias, as I said, was from Epirus, and so Pyrrhus was the first cousin of Alexander the Great. That's quite high standing, actually. As royalty in exile, he had an unfortunate child. I won't get into why he was in exile. As royalty in exile, he had an unfortunate childhood, and he had an unfortunate face. Plutarch says that he had more of the terrors than of the augustness of kingly power, since he did not have a regular set of upper teeth, but in the place of them one continued bone with small lines marked on it, resembling the divisions of a row of teeth. And this is just thrown in for humor. He was also rumored to have magical powers and could cure spleens by touching his right foot to the stomach of the afflicted person. His right big toe contained the magic, apparently. Despite these personal disadvantages, Pyrrhus had made a smart marriage to the stepdaughter of Ptolemy himself. At this point, Pyrrhus, in exile, he married Ptolemy's stepdaughter. He asked Ptolemy, his father-in-law, for help in getting his old kingdom of Epirus back again. Ptolemy was more than happy to attack Demetrius, who now had control of Epirus as well as Greece and Macedonia. With Egyptian forces behind him, Pyrrhus took back Epirus. By 286, he had overrun the rest of Macedonia as well and driven Demetrius out. Demetrius fled into Asia Minor, and this is the end of Demetrius. In an excess of hubris, he decided to attack Seleucus in the east. That doesn't say in my sources what kind of forces Demetrius had, but they couldn't have been great. In addition, he was likely an alcoholic, and by Macedonian standards, that was probably something to see. He was likely an alcoholic and either suicidal or delusional by this time. Seleucus swatted him like a fly and put him under house arrest, where he drank himself to death. End of Demetrius, but it's not the end of the Antigonids. Antigonus, a descendant of Antigonus, eventually emerges and gets back to Greece and Macedonia and controls it, but that's for the future. The dynasty is not over, but Demetrius is off the table. Now, unfortunately for Pyrrhus, the rule of Macedonia did not last very long. He managed to stay there for 2 years. Lysimicus decided to come down from Thrace, and he drove him out. Lysimicus, Plutarch said, had nothing else to do. That's what Plutarch says. Pyrrhus withdrew to Epirus, which Lysimachus, perhaps out of respect for Alexander's cousin, he allowed him to keep. He didn't try to kill him. Now that means the 4 kings had now become 3: Ptolemy, Seleucus, and Lysimachus. The satrapies had become 3 kingdoms: the Ptolemaic, the Seleucid, and the much smaller combined Thracian Macedonia domain. The custom is that a kingdom will be named after a person, Seleucus, with the suffix id, Seleucid. And why Ptolemaic is Ptolemaic and not Ptolemid You always see Ptolemaic though, but that's the way it is. And in the end, as one of my sources pointed out, we now have a three-way split in the empire, but it's really not so very new. Under the Persians, the Persians had recurrent problems in holding Egypt. Maybe distance had a great deal to do with it. And they also had a loose hold on India for the same reason. And they had never conquered Greece. So the three-way split could be seen both, it was visible very early before Alexander, and it persisted, during the wars of the successors. You ended up with three power centers, and that was the persistent situation with different players, obviously. But does anybody have anything to add to that? Well, anyway, I am at slide.
You could add the fact that one real big difference here that differentiated this is that the Southern Greeks, in contrast to the Eastern Greeks, the Eastern Greeks had been subjects of the Persian Empire really since the Ionic Rebellion in 500 BC. So they had really gotten used to having curtailed independence. But the cities of Greece, not so much. Even though there was a Spartan and Athenian hegemony, when you read the sources, you can see that there were always, the Thebans jumped in, the Olympians jumped in. There was always attempts to reassert independence. So that governing the Greeks in the West was very different from governing everybody else, because the Greeks in the West were much less willing to put up with it. And ultimately, what you needed to do with the Greeks in the West is kind of rule them with a light hand, give them as much autonomy as you could afford to do it, because the harsher you came down on them, the more likely they were to rebel. And that wasn't really the same way in the East.
Because I think actually most of the generals that you talked about at one point or another proclaimed like the freedom of the Greek cities. The Greek cities weren't really free, but you had a bunch of those decrees that basically told them they could be free. And even though the Greek cities fell under more control over the other, you have to maintain that illusion. It's kind of interesting.
And I'm going to talk about that in 2 weeks, but it's this famous declaration by Antigonus, the Declaration of Tyre, when he was besieging Tyre. And it was a propaganda move to basically guarantee, to seem to be guaranteeing the freedom of the Greeks. Cassander was very harsh on the Greeks, and so that was one reason that Demetrius did so well when he went back, and was received very positively by the Athenians. It was associated with this big propaganda move of freedom for the Greeks, and Antigonus very much kind of lived by that. And that was another really successful. Antigonus did a lot of very successful things, and that was one of them.
Okay, this is Pyrrhus. I just put in a slide about what happened to Pyrrhus. It's interesting. This is a footnote. Took place over in Italy. Rome, carrying on its dreary annual campaigns against its neighbors, was attacking the city of Tarentum, a Greek colony in the south. Tarentum sent messengers to Greece asking for help. The call was answered by Pyrrhus, who was penned up in Epirus with no other chance of extending his power or winning any glory. So Pyrrhus left Epirus and sailed for Tarentum. Once there, he bought and borrowed war elephants, probably from Carthage, and mercenaries who were largely Samnite. These were the peoples that Rome was currently at war with in this period, and they eventually absorbed them into Rome. And this was for the defense of the cities. When the Romans attacked, Pyrrhus inflicted heavy losses on them. The Romans had never seen elephants before. Then Pyrrhus drove them back to within 40 miles of the city of Rome itself. In the following year, 279, we're a bit ahead of ourselves in the main narrative, he tried to follow up on this with another pitched battle, the one fought at Asculum. He won this encounter too, but in such hard fighting that he lost as many men as the Romans. When a soldier congratulated him on the victory, he answered, "Another such victory will utterly undo me. In such a way did Pyrrhus gain an immortal eponymous adjective Pyrrhic. I can't think of many other ancients who've been honored this way, and only the most famous get that treatment. And he's relatively unknown. You have Ciceronian and that sort of adjective, but Pyrrhic has entered most European languages. For what reason is unclear. But anyway, by 275, Pyrrhus had enough campaigning against Rome. He left Tarentum to its own problems and went back to Greece. And just to end on another comic note, 3 years later, the Romans finally managed to conquer and sack Tarentum. In that same year, Pyrrhus, back in Greece, still looking for glory, was fighting a nasty little Spartan civil war when an old woman threw a tile at him. This is Plutarch, by the way. An old woman threw a tile at him from the rooftop and knocked him unconscious. He was at once killed by his opponent and his corpse was burned. Only the magical big toe remained. This is what Plutarch says. I don't know what he means. A bone would have remained, but could magic inhere in a bone? Anyway, I just leave that, throw that out for you. Let's keep. Now, okay, so let's have a discussion of the Battle of Ipsis itself. To begin with, this is a slide on the battle tactics of the successors. How did they conduct their warfare? In the main, the successors just continued Alexander's style of warfare, including Alexander's one innovation in Greek warfare, the use of the elephant. So far as there was an arms race among the successors, was only to create ever bigger versions of the same machines as Alexander's, the ships or siege engines. In 306, young Demetrius could even mobilize fabulous siege towers 120 feet high. By 318, 5 years after Alexander's death, by 318, war elephants were being used extensively by the Greeks. An Indian expert had taught the Greeks some tactical tricks, in particular how to conceal spiked planks in the ground so the soft undersides of the elephant's feet would become impaled. The Greeks made repeated use of this in their frequent battles. As we will see, elephants were the critical factor in the outcome of the Battle of Ipsis, as we shall see. Okay, here's the Battle of Ipsis with another imaginary picture. It was fought near the town of Ipsis in Phrygia in central Anatolia. I will mention it was Antigonus, to repeat myself. Antigonus and Demetrius of Macedon were pitted against a coalition of 3 allies, Lysimicus, Seleucus, and Cassander. This is a picture of Seleucus. Seleucus Nicator, Seleucus Victor was his not title, but his term of glory, I guess, like Pompeius Magnus. But the opposing forces under the Antagonists, Antigonus's forces, according to Plutarch, Antigonus's army before the battle numbered about 70,000 infantry, 10,000 cavalry, and 75 war elephants. Pay attention to the number of war elephants. The majority of this number were presumably supplied by Antigonus's army that marched from Syria, since Demetrius's army in Greece had no elephants and only 1,500 cavalry. Diodorus claims, that's another historian, Diodorus claims that Demetrius had approximately 5,600 infantry in Greece, but it is unclear what proportion of this infantry accompanied him into Asia. There's a lot of detail, but basically they were pretty evenly matched, except that you notice the Antagonids has 75 war elephants, and the allies, supported by Seleucus from the east, he had 480 elephants. They were well supplied, and they had side chariots as well, which the Antagonids did not. Okay. So basically, it's all very hypothetical as far as the forces available were concerned, but pretty evenly matched, except there was a real disparity in available elephants. So as far as strategic and tactical considerations go, in terms of overall strategy, it is clear that both sides had resolved on battle. For the allies, it represented the best chance of stopping Antigonus's expansion rather than allowing themselves to be defeated piecemeal. For Antigonus, the chance to defeat all his enemies at once could not be passed up, even though Ptolemy was sitting it out. Even if he would have preferred to defeat them individually, obviously. However, little is known about the specific strategic considerations facing the two sides before the battle, as the precise circumstances and location of the engagement remain uncertain. Tactically, both sides faced the common problem of the wars fought amongst the successors. How to defeat an army? This is a problem of the successors in particular. How do you defeat an army equipped in the same manner and using the same basic tactics? The successors seem to be inherently conservative and continue to favor a strong attack with cavalry on the right wing of the battle line. These were tactics invented by Philip and continued by Alexander. And the strong cavalry attack was the principal tactical thrust. Even though the successors continued to do this, even though they must have been aware that their opponents would be doing exactly the same thing on the opposite side of the battlefield. When armies were numerically even and deploying the same tactic, gaining a clear advantage was difficult. It was a long way from Alexander's day when he could launch a cavalry charge from the right directly at Darius's tent. It was just different. And there were also the use of novel weapons, such as the war elephants and scythe chariots. These could, and they were in greater numbers now, at least the elephant. These could be used to change the tactical balance, and this is what was done by the successors, but such innovations were easily copied. Thus, both sides at Ipsis had war elephants, in addition to the scythe chariots. Scythe chariots are the ones with sharp things pointing out from the wheels. Both sides therefore sought an open battlefield. The allies, in order to use the very large number of elephants to full potential, and the Antigonids to allow full use of their strong cavalry arm. For the Antigonids, strong in both infantry and cavalry, the tactical situation was straightforward and followed the template successor tactic of a massive cavalry assault on the right wing. For the allies, it's a little bit different. For the allies, and this is all very hypothetical, the source admits, for the allies weaker in infantry, the tactics would have been to maximize their overwhelming superiority in elephants, though it is not clear exactly how they intended to do this. Nevertheless, the elephants played a pivotal role in the battle. So as far as the battle goes, it's a very schematic map. As far as the deployment goes, both sides probably, you have the allies on the top and the Antigonids on the bottom, and the blue shades out Antigonus's name, pretty much. Both sides probably deployed their troops in a standard Macedonian formation with the phalanx of heavy, heavy infantry in the center of the battle line, and light infantry would have been deployed in front along with some elephants. We don't have numbers on that. Cavalry was split between the two wings. Traditionally, the best goes on the right. In this case, and we know that because it was led by Antigonus' son Demetrius, who would have gotten the position of honor. Okay, this is a bit. This is different, and this may have been a problem. We aren't sure, but Antigonus may have been personally positioned in the center behind the phalanx, right there, which probably wasn't a great idea, but there he was. And the 75 elephants that he had were deployed in front of the battle line with their infantry guards. Now, as you can see, the little oval shapes, those are elephants. The allies under Seleucus, because he was the man from the east, they had a great many. And there may have been an elephant reserve that this map portrays, but that actually isn't certain. The situation with the Allied deployment is is less clear than the allies, than the Antigonids. Plutarch states that Seleucus' son Antiochus was in command of the cavalry on the left wing, traditionally the weaker wing in the Macedonian system, meant only to skirmish, really. However, it has been suggested that on this occasion, the allied cavalry were evenly split between the two wings. We do not know who commanded the right wing, nor where Lysimicus or Seleucus were stationed. This map makes the claim that they were here, but my source here says we don't know. It is clear that some of Seleucus's elephants were placed in front of the battle lines, but not how many, though a figure of 100 is often suggested. That's versus 75 on Antigonus' side. It has been suggested that Seleucus retained command of the majority of his elephants in a tactical reserve. That would have been this. And that's later movement, which I'll get to, but this is the hypothetical reserve. They had to be somewhere, but this is what won the battle, though. But he may have had a reserve, but the use of such a large reserve would have been unprecedented in battles amongst the successors. Nobody else ever did that. Furthermore, it would have been shunning an opportunity to deploy the major tactical advantage held by the allies. As modern sources point out, understanding this, quote, elephant problem, end quote, is key to understanding the outcome of the battle, but the ancient sources do not allow the point to be resolved. As far as the initial phase of the battle goes, it seems to have begun in earnest with the clash of the elephants from both sides. That would have been why they have Lysimicus advancing. I guess they don't know that, who advanced first, but that's the map. There was a clash of these elephants from both sides. Men would have been in little boxes on top of the elephants' backs with javelins and things like that. Diodorus says that the elephants of Antigonus and Lysimicus fought as if nature had matched them equally in courage and strength, suggesting that they were also equal in number, while 75 and 100 is fairly close. Demetrius then launched the principal Antigonid thrust, maneuvering his cavalry around the elephants. I guess the elephants here, to attack Antiochus. He attacked the allied cavalry under Antiochus. Plutarch says that Demetrius fought brilliantly and routed his enemy. They took off that way. However, it is also clear that Demetrius allowed the pursuit of the routed allied cavalry to go too far. Cavalry just took off to go slaughter people. However, and thus ends the first phase. Demetrius's cavalry basically became isolated from the battlefield. The second phase, it is not explicitly stated by Plutarch, but it has been assumed that the two phalanxes engaged each other during the battle, which seems obvious, but it's not actually stated. If this was the case, then the Antigonid strategy would have been for Demetrius to take his cavalry and attack the rear of the allied phalanx, which we've seen that in Alexander's battles more than once. Alternatively, he could resume his station on the right wing and protect the Antigonid phalanx's flank. However, Demetrius has found himself, since his forces were way out here. I apologize, I couldn't follow a map that follows my talk precisely, but I'll try to fill it in with the cursor. He wasn't, because he found that there were 300 elephants deployed in his path, and he couldn't make his way through. The ancient sources repeatedly emphasize the effect of elephants on horses, which are alarmed by the smell and noise of elephants and are loath to approach them. Demetrius would not have been able to take his horses through the line of elephants, nor maneuver around such a large quantity of elephants. This elephant maneuver was the decisive moment in the battle, but it is not clear how it came about. Plutarch only says that the allied elephants were thrown in his way. If the elephants had indeed been held in reserve, then it might have been relatively straightforward to deploy them, but as discussed, it is not clear why so many elephants would have been held in reserve, because they could have been used to attack the enemy directly. However, it is also possible that the deployment of the elephants was a piece of improvisation during the battle, though moving such a large number of elephants in such a coordinated maneuver in the middle of the battle would have been difficult. Since he was the only Allied commander with significant experience of handling elephants, it has been assumed that Seleucus was responsible for this maneuver. As we can see, a lot is unknown about this battle. But with Demetrius now isolated from the battlefield, which is fact, the Antigonid phalanx was exposed on its right flank. Plutarch describes what follows. Seleucus, observing that his opponent's phalanx was unprotected by cavalry, took measures accordingly. He did not actually charge upon them, but kept them in fear of a charge, but continually riding around them, thus giving an opportunity to come over to his side. And this is what actually came to pass. I'm not quite sure what, I assume what riding around means. Seleucus took some of his elephants and went like this. Does anybody have any ideas as to what actually happened here? In addition to this, the Antigonid phalanx and the Allied phalanx engaged in a stiff and chaotic fight. Now I should say I should point out Seleucus has cavalry up here as well as elephants. I just noticed that's not mentioned on the map actually. So the move against the Antigonid right flank probably involved attaching cavalry from the Allies' own right wing over here. So they moved cavalry from the right wing over to here, and this would have included some horse archers. They could rain down missiles on the immobile phalanx. The morale of the troops appeared to have collapsed, and it seems that some of the heavy infantry either defected to the Allied side or otherwise fled. Antigonus, stationed in the center, tried to rally his men, hoping for Demetrius. He's 80 years old, I might point out. Tried to rally his men, hoping for Demetrius's return. However, he was gradually surrounded by Allied infantry and eventually killed by several javelins thrown by Allied skirmishers. With the death of its commander, the Antigonid battle line dissolved and the battle effectively ended. A new factor, war elephants, had entered Macedonian warfare and was decisive. It defeated Antigonus and set the pattern of the Hellenistic kingdoms, which is what modern scholars call them, for the next 270 years. It all depended on one battle. Nobody after Antigonus was able to put together enough force to make a claim for the whole empire. Any comments or questions? He said, sorry, the description of the battle may not have been entirely clear, but it isn't to anybody as to what went on, except the elephants were critical, and the flank of the Antigonus's right flank was exposed, and that's a recipe for disaster, as you know.
So I took a course on this with
Oh, good.
with
Enlighten.
Richard Billows, who is the as he put it, wrote the book on Antigonus One Eye, and he insisted that the main role of the elephants here was as a screen. It wasn't that the elephants were a devastating part of the battle, killing people. It was basically that they were used effectively as a screen to keep Demetrius off the battlefield. And Billows, and it's hard to agree with him, but he felt that in general, elephants were not really significant contributors to victory, that they were too unreliable, they were too likely to go amok and charge among your own troops, and that once if you were able to kill their mahout, that elephants had a lifetime bonding to one mahout. So if you killed them, the elephants would just go nuts and start, flailing around at whoever was nearby, which was more likely to be your own troops than the enemy's troops.
Yeah, I read that anybody with elephants would have to have special poisons available. If the mahout was lost, they would have to kill the elephant.
Right, right. So
they would just shoot poisoned arrows at the elephant to eliminate their own. They were too dangerous to them.
So Billows argued that it was, having that large mass of elements and being able to use them as a screen that was decisive in the outcome.
Yeah, this was the only map I could find online, and somewhat unsatisfactory. But in any event, the Allies won, and it was decisive for future history. So,
Couple of questions, John.
yes.
What was the ethnicity of Mahmud, if you know? Were they all Indian or
The ethnicity of who?
Mahmud, the one who rode the elephant?
That's kind of I don't know, considering the integration
I
of
think they have to be
Iranians.
Indian because the elephants were given as a gift by King Poros, and the Mahouts came with them.
Yeah. Well, there hadn't been that much time for the Macedonians to gain any skill in them either. So that makes sense.
The Makud, their lives entangled, the Makud and the elephant.
Yeah, it must
from early on. I mean, it's not that it takes a long time.
Right. Yeah, probably. I mean, I don't know what the maturity is of an elephant, but probably at least 10 or 15 years.
Wow, since the baby, basically. Wow. So the second question I have, as we know, Romans, especially, the Afrikaners figured out the way of tangling the, issue with elephants. And even Paul had said that they were only used as a screen. But did anybody try to figure out this problem with elephants and try to tackle it, open the lines, put the, needles on the ground?
Well, the Romans really figured out how to neutralize elephants, and it was largely with things to attack their feet.
Right. But not at this time. At this time, there was no clear, because they're all using the same strategies. They're almost like a World War I, where nobody got anywhere, really. Trench war. This is like everybody's using the same strategy. Elephants, kind of like using as a screen here and there, and sarissas and, phalanx and stuff like that. I mean, anybody came with like, what? Let's do something different.
Well, another element that was part of this is that a significant amount of these armies were mercenaries, and mercenaries don't really have an incentive to fight to the death, right? Mercenaries, at a certain point they see they're losing, and they figure, and usually the commander on the other side would be more than happy to take them in and pay them himself. So, when things got tough, the mercenaries became extremely unreliable. So you had troops of different quality involved. Even though you had the phalanx, there were many different types of troops that are involved in it. I mean, we didn't talk about it at all, but really one of the most, interesting parts of this period was the warfare between Antigonus and Eumenes of Cardia, which was really interesting. And Eumenes of Cardia was a really creative and outside the box military thinker who kept embarrassing Antigonus, and making him look like an idiot.
I didn't. You might discuss that in more detail, Paul, in your piece, because I didn't include him because he was Greek and he didn't look like one of the major players, even though he is fascinating.
One could think that he distracted Antigonus at the height of Antigonus's power. Antigonus spent an awful long time trying to chase down Eumenes, and ultimately succeeded. But Eumenes had in his army the group that were called the Silver Shields, which were phalangists in their 50s who had been with Alexander from the beginning and had been given silver shields as a recognition of merit and who they were, and they were like unstoppable on the battlefield. What Antigonus ultimately was able to do was, even though his army was getting chopped into ribbons by the silver shields, he was able to send cavalry and take the silver shields baggage camp, which had all of their lifetime possessions and their wives and children. So basically, in the middle of the battle, the Silver Shields turned sides because what they were fighting for had been taken, and they handed Eumenes over to Antigonus, who kind of reluctantly had him executed, because Antigonus spent a lot of time trying to recruit Eumenes and get him on his side because he respected his ability as a general.
Wow. And I don't know if anybody's going to touch on this, but thank you, Paul, first of all. But you know, the possession of the Roxanne's child and Roxanne herself. I remember, I think it was either Cassandra or whoever grabbed her, and what, you know, kind of like, well, now we have a royal, child, so to speak, and now we're entitled to it. Also, when I was in Turkey, and we all know that Alexander the Great tomb is not actually his tomb in Istanbul, but the story is that when the actual tomb was actually traveling to Macedonia, from when he died in Babylon, Ptolemy stole it and brought it back to Egypt. So they also said so what I'm trying to say is that they were also saying whoever contained Alexander tomb should be, his, descent, should be the guy who ruled the empire, and then whoever have the royal child should be. So it's like they basically tearing the whole, anything they can grab upon. It's almost like, a holy man's, whoever possesses his buttons or something like that is, should be able to rule the empire. But this is the whole interesting aspect to me is, it's like they almost said like, screw you, I don't care if you have his tomb, I don't care if you have his child, and the child and the mother Roxana getting killed in the end after they were deemed to be useless in that regard.
Well, Ptolemy was really aggressive at this stage in his career and took some real chances. So from my reading, it says that Ptolemy actually was in touch with the general of Perdiccas, who was in charge of Alexander's funeral cortege. And it was prearranged that guy was going to hand it over, because Perdiccas was concerned that Ptolemy was going to try something like that, but Ptolemy had really, gotten a jump on him and had arranged it. Now, at the time that this happened, this was when Perdiccas was marching towards Macedonia with the royals. He had Alexander IV, he had Aridaeus with him, and his whole idea was to go and basically install them with Antipater, right? And then he would essentially be able to rule the empire as regent. So when Ptolemy pulled off this stunt to hijack Alexander's funeral cortege, Perdiccas had to basically turn around. He never made it back to Macedonia. And instead of taking the kings there, he took them back down and, and then had this disastrous invasion of an incompetent invasion of Egypt, where he got thousands of his own troops drowned in the Nile. They decided to kill him as a reward for all of that. So, but the bottom line was when Ptolemy did this, it was like the first real slap in the face against Perdiccas. And Perdiccas knew that if he didn't take action against Ptolemy, his whole authority would collapse. And so Ptolemy basically, he had marched from, Perdiccas had marched from Babylon. He was all the way in Asia Minor, heading towards crossing the Hellespont. And then he had to turn around and go all the way back to Egypt. So basically Ptolemy had him running around like a chicken with his head cut off, and then was able to take advantage and came out, looking like this bold, which at that point he was. But the one real huge advantage that Ptolemy had in Egypt, which is that of all of these provinces that were taken by the successors, Egypt had the most defensible borders.
Oh,
Right? If you look at it, the place that had it the worst was the center. Whoever had Asia had open borders on the east, the south, and the north from Greece, the west. It was really impossible to get secure borders if you had the center. In Egypt, the only way there was through, marching along the coast past Gaza. And that was really difficult to do. It was a desert, and you essentially needed to have naval superiority so that you could bring water to your army while it was making that trip. And just one last thing, an instructive thing to do is if you look in World War I at the attempts of the British to go from Egypt north into Palestine against the Turks, and of the Turks to go south from Palestine into Egypt, they all ended up collapsing because of their inability to get water and supplies to their troops in this desert south of Gaza. So as late as the 20th century, this area that was so forbidding to troops, that was what made Ptolemy, essentially secure. If he could defend the Nile, basically there was no one that could really stop him. He took Kyrene to the west. He had no real potential opposition all the way until Tunisia and the Carthaginians. In the south, the Nubians and the Ethiopians were very disorganized and they didn't represent a threat. So that was his big advantage.
So, and then to that regard, and then maybe I'm jumping ahead, and Paul, stop me if I'm jumping ahead, but the things to go first, right? All those Indian, you'll say semi-Greek empires. Then we got Seleucid Empire. There's been only like 100 years, 150 years, then it's gone. Then, the Ptolemy is the only one that really, and, they kind of like stayed around for hundreds of years. Everybody else was kind of like, bye-bye.
But the interesting thing was the reason they stayed around is because they were the weakest. And as the weakest, they made an alliance with the Romans.
I see.
yeah.
Right? And it was the Romans that
One thing about Egypt, Egypt was the most rich place in the whole colonies for all the vegetation and all the things that they have. But also they have the desert on the left, the desert on the right, the delta on the north. People could not come through the delta. And then you have the mountains in the south. So it was very well protected, was organized, and was the richest part of the whole colonies. So,
but they did have a manpower problem.
I just also wanted to say about this Seleucid Empire. As they lost the eastern territories, they still maintained the Syrian, right? They inheritors of the Syrian Empire, right? Because
the Syrian piece was really the richest part of Seleucus Empire, and
right,
he kept it.
and they took it from Antigonus, right? And
yes, at Ipsis.
Right, right, and then of course the son of Seleucid was Antiochus.
Right, and it's interesting because Seleucus and Antiochus were kind of analogous to Antigonus and Demetrius. They both, they both made their sons joint kings, and they both had sons who proved themselves to be effective on the battlefield and were effectively partners in their reign. I don't know whether you were going to talk about it at all, John, but there's an interesting contrast with Lysimicus, who ended up actually executing his son, even though his son had demonstrated, his son had beaten Demetrius twice. So his son really was an ideal successor, but few years before, maybe 4 or 5 years before Lysimachus's death, he executed his son. And there's no real explanation for this in the sources. It's all speculation, but we know that he did it.
That was
And,
the end of that part, right? Of his
he would, right,
dynasty,
basically,
whatever.
there was no future for him after he did that.
But what happened to Demetrius? Where he ended up? I mean, did
Well, he fled. He fled after this battle,
Yes.
after Ipsis, and he went to Greece, and he had some success there. And ultimately, it was his son. His son was Antigonus Gonatas,
Yeah, he got control of.
right? And Antigonus Gonatas basically made his bones by fighting against the Gauls and successfully resisting them. That made him kind of really raised his profile and made him very popular among the Greeks, because he was able to present himself as the savior of the Greeks from the Gauls.
that's the invasion of Asia Minor, right? By the Gauls. Yeah. So,
Well, the Gauls first invaded Greece.
right, but then they invaded Asia
Then they
Minor,
invaded
right?
Asia Minor. But what I'm saying is
278
that
or
the
something,
Greeks,
yeah.
Antigonus was very happy to get them into Asia Minor, because that meant that Greece was now secure. And he said, okay, Asia
Right.
Minor is not my problem.
So what did his successor rule somewhere?
Whose successor?
The Demetrius, the
Yeah, Antigonus Gonatas became the ruler of all Greece and Macedon, and King Philip V, who fought against the Romans, was a direct descendant of Antigonus Gonatas.
Okay,
Yeah, it is odd.
The royal family of Macedon, at the point that they fought the Romans, were the dynasty of Antigonus Gonatas.
Yeah,
all right.
I was surprised Antigonus lost big at Ipsis, but his dynasty managed to survive and prosper for a while.
Okay, let's continue.
Okay, I got this picture just because it's so colorful. I don't vouch for its historicity. Maybe some of you can comment on that. But what was the aftermath of Ipsis? I'm going to cover some of what we have been discussing already. From the wreck of the Antigonid army, Demetrius managed to recover 5,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry and escaped with them to Ephesus. That's on the western edge of Anatolia. Despite the expectation that he would raid the Ephesian treasury, Demetrius instead immediately sets sail for Greece. That gives some more detail to what we've been discussing. He was putting his chief remaining hopes in Athens. However, he was to be disappointed. The Athenians had voted not to allow any of the kings into Athens. Concealing his wrath, he asked the Athenians for the return of his ships that were moored there. And then he sailed on to the Isthmus of Corinth. He found that everywhere his garrisons were being expelled and his erstwhile allies defecting to the other kings. He left Pyrrhus of Epirus, at that time that was part of the Antigonid faction, in charge of the Antigonid cause in Greece, and himself sailed to the Thracian Chersonnesos. As I said, the Battle of Ipsus was the last chance to reunite the Alexandrine Empire. As historian Paul K. Davis writes, Ipsus was the high point of the struggle among Alexander the Great's successors to create an international Hellenistic empire, which Antigonus failed to do. Instead, the empire was carved up between the victors, with Ptolemy retaining Egypt, Seleucus expanding his power to eastern Asia Minor, which has been Antigonid territory, and Lysimicus received the remainder of Asia Minor. Eventually, Seleucus would defeat Lysimicus at the Battle of Currapedium in 281 BC, but Seleucus was assassinated shortly afterwards, but his dynasty survived. Ipsis finalized the breakup of an empire, which may account for its obscurity. Despite that, it was still a critical battle in classical history and decided the character of the Hellenistic age.
At the same time, it's true that Antigonus was already pretty far advanced on a downward trajectory by the time he got to Ipsis. The two big disasters that were like the point of inflection for Antigonus were the war against Seleucus, when Seleucus was in Babylon, right? And so Seleucus had fled to the court of Ptolemy, where he'd been given um, sanctuary. And then when
He was a
Antigonus,
naval, he was admiral there, right? He made him an admiral, Ptolemy.
in any event, Seleucus, went back to Mesopotamia really as fast as he could and regained power in Babylon, and basically fought Antigonus to a standstill. And Antigonus was forced to recognize his independence, right? I think this was like, maybe 305, 306 or something like that. And pretty much around the same time, Antigonus had sent Demetrius to attack Ptolemy, and they fought the Battle of Gaza, which was another big victory for Ptolemy, defeat for Demetrius. Antigonus had to try to come down and pull Demetrius's acorns out of the fire. So Antigonus was already on a very, he had already lost the crucial battles on his south, so that he was vulnerable to being attacked from two directions, or really three directions, if you think Ptolemy comes from the southwest, Seleucus comes from the southeast, and Cassander and Lysimicus come from the north.
Well, I thought I'd conclude with two maps. This is the successor kingdoms right before the Battle of Ipsis in 3001, with Seleucus, as you can see, the various players. And this is the kingdoms. You can't get two maps to be very congruent, but this is the kingdoms after the Battle of Ipsis. Cassandrus is here. And again, this is in 301 BC. We've discussed things that occurred in the two decades following this. So Cassander is still in charge in Macedonia and Greece. This is the realm of Lysimicus. This is Ptolemy down here. And this is Seleucus right here. And that, it took a while for everything to stabilize, but then the rest of the Hellenistic period begins to unfold, and it will be covered by my colleague, Paul.
There is an argument to be made that Lysimachus had an outside chance of reuniting the empire.
Really?
In the 280s. Basically, what was happening then was that Ptolemy I had basically resigned the throne in favor of his son Ptolemy II, who was not an accomplished military man. And so he was known to be smart, but he was not a military threat right now. So it took he was not really a player at that point. Lysimachus had taken Greece from Cassander, and he had a confrontation with Seleucus, where if he had where his objective really was to kill Seleucus personally. Had he killed Seleucus personally, then the argument could have been made that there was no one else to stop him and he could have taken the rest of the empire. But in the fact, the exact opposite happened, and he was killed, not Seleucus. And that was the end of Lysimachus, 281, I think. Corupedion.
Yes,
It's interesting on this map, you could see how small the Roman Republic is compared to all these giants.
They're waiting in the wings.
Oh, and when we're talking about Pyrrhus, one thing he didn't mention is that after having his battles with the Roman army in southern Italy, Pyrrhus went to Sicily. Right, he was called to Sicily, to help the Greek cities fight against the Carthaginians. Right. And so Pyrrhus was kind of aimless. He had a lot of reputation as being an excellent military commander, but very little strategic sense. And he kind of dissipated himself fighting here, fighting there, fighting in the other place. And his actual death was kind of a really kind of, comic story of his elephants getting caught in a gateway trying to get into Argos. some sort of story like that where, you know, you can imagine these beasts stuck in the doorway, and Pyrrhus himself was inside the city where he got whopped in the head by that tile, as John described. But what he was doing was waiting for his elephants to come in, and they got stuck.
That's why there is a term Pyrrhus victory, because
Well, that actually
no
comes from his
strategy.
battle with the Romans.
The
The Pyrrhus
Romans.
victory comes with his battle from the Romans.
Yeah,
where-
that's right. But I meant no strategy. I meant to your earlier comments
Yes,
that
yeah.
he was not a strategist.
Yeah, he didn't have much of a strategy. Perdiccas didn't have much of a strategy. Ptolemy did. Lysimicus did, and Seleucus did.
Yeah, this is really fascinating. But it looks like just looking by the size and everything that and Seleucus it seems like the most fascinating. I mean, the whole thing is fall and serving in under Ptolemy in Egypt for a while, because Ptolemy utilized his military skills. From what I read, he made him an admiral, and he served, you know, on the sea for a while, and then he came back. And then look at this battle of Ipsis and
Right.
this huge empire. But eventually, I mean, a few generations later, you know, it is the newcomer. I think you I don't know if you're going to cover it, but it's interesting. Very little I know. It's kind of a little bit blind spot for me yet. Is about the rise of the Parthian Empire and how they're ones that took away all of that. Destroyed the Seleucid Empire, from what I remember.
Right. Well, those Eastern Greek kingdoms were pretty tenacious, and they lasted for a while. The big, you know, Seleucus, it was the Battle of Babylon that was big for Seleucus, because he was relatively unknown. He had been a fugitive in Egypt. He was not of the same rank as the other players, and he was, you know, he came from nowhere to beat Antigonus in Babylon, and that was like, everybody said, "Oh, okay, well, Seleucus, you know, that he pulled off. That was like a tremendous victory against all odds, against all expectations, that he was able to prevail there, and that ultimately ended up, you know, he was the decisive factor in the final defeat of Antigonus."
All right. So,
Well, that's all I have.
okay, great, John. That was great
I
recap.
hope
I mean,
Yeah.
I find it's a very fiendishly complex situation. I tried to turn it into a decent narrative. So
I must say, people talk about Game of Thrones being based on the War of the Roses in England,
yeah,
but to me, it's much more this, you know, the wars of the Diadochi, you know, because Game of Thrones has this huge, you know, geographic space from, you know, the frozen north all the way to the deserts in the south. You don't have that in England. But in
yeah, but you have a wall.
Alexander's,
You have a famous wall of Adrian. That must
And-
be a biggest
here-
metaphor, right?
if you look at the size of this empire and the way
Yeah.
that they use their, you know, they use their daughters and killed their brothers, it was just like out of Game of Thrones, right?
Yeah.
When Seleucus went back to Babylon, Ptolemy took that opportunity to basically take Palestine. So Palestine was ruled by the Ptolemies for about 100 years. But the Seleucids, you know, they had a debt of gratitude to Ptolemy, who basically protected Seleucus when he was forced to flee. So they you know, he wouldn't, but Seleucus never recognized Ptolemy's claim. And then his descendants chiefly Antiochus III, fought battle after battle after battle to try to take back Palestine, and ultimately did at around 200 BC.
Yeah, John, this was amazing. I mean, very good. And then the
John,
triple.
you did a great job. And
Thank you. It was too much of a lecture, but the
Oh, it doesn't,
quantity,
because we're eating this stuff up. We
a
love
big
it.
empire, and on top of it, the Greek names. So you did great.
Yeah, yeah, we need to, exactly. It's like when it's almost like when you enter biblical times, who is who. When I was doing the the war of Jewish wars, you also have to kind of get together and names. You have to name the names. Who is the major players? Who are the minor players? And unfortunately, here everybody is a player, but but who do you distinguish? And you did a good job in showing that to us. Appreciate it very much.
yeah, I tried to get a clear narrative. That was my main goal here, which is this is a period in history where it's difficult to do that, I think.
Yeah, and it's because I mean he left, like you said, he's one of those emperors or kings or whatever who didn't leave a clear path. This is this is that. But I don't think anybody would have cared. Macedonians were Greeks, but they still were savage, tribe. So they were like, okay, everything is going to be by force. They were even kidding, saying, listen, when Macedonian kills, they're not going to use a poison. They're going to chop your head off. That's just the way that they behaved. And the only thing they knew is force.
Yeah, well, I do get the impression Alexander was so caught up in the day-to-day that he didn't give a thought to future planning. He had this general goal of conquering the Persian Empire, but what would happen after him was never crossed his mind, apparently.
Yeah, I mean, he just channeled their aggressiveness toward conquest, and he never sat down and said, okay, now guys, let's use diplomacy and maybe create some kind of committee or a senate that we can decide things peacefully. He left it all to go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, in a modern army, you set up a committee to an office to plan the after-war. When you've won, what do you do? That certainly happened with the Allies in World War II. These ancients had, they had no idea of this, I suspect. Once we get all of this, how do we hold it? It seems to have been very.
But if you look at Ottoman Empire, for example, right? So in harems, they had 40, 50 children that could be descendants, right, whatnot, who could take the throne. And they used to kill 39 of them and one would be remain. So they kind of had a plan. It's a ruthless plan, but it's never the mind, let's not divide the empire. Later on.
But I think they had an institution. The Ottoman Empire, for many ages, it had an institution. This is like an absolutely new-made empire. There was tremendous. Never thought of how you're going to govern this. How they didn't establish all of that. They relied on some existing structures, but there was no for the whole empire. They centralized rule, and he didn't even think about this. So even if he would have established, even if Alexander would have given it his throne to someone specifically, there would be the same thing. Nobody could have held this empire. There haven't been such a big empire before. I mean, Persian Empire was a little smaller, but it was well thought out, especially by Darius. I think he was administrative genius. I think he's done a lot of things, and he had to hold that. Alexander, he only ruled, like he was conquering for 10 years. I mean, he wasn't even ruling, And now
Philip also ruled and conquered in the beginning, and Philip, his father, right?
Yeah, but they're much smaller territories. It's a different thing.
I mean, the major complex territories to conquer and to hold was the Greek ones, right? The problem was that a lot of the Greeks were disjointed. There was some alliances. Peloponnesian was, but if you conquer that region, now you kind of combine all the Greeks and say, let's go revenge for what they did at, you know, Marathon and Thermopylae. Let's go revenge Persians. You know, what I'm just saying is they were able to promote, you know, Alexander. You know, they had other options, right? They had you know, other options to go for. So he was able to kind of grab that. So I think the leader could have developed somehow to hold it all together. Maybe not for long, but still. Maybe I'm naive in that part of the world, but
I don't think it's
I think
possible
the dealer
to hold this huge empire.
I mean, look,
so
you had
different.
major, what, how many major, you know, major players? You might have 4 or 5 major players, right? Ptolemy, there's this, that's Seleucus. And so why not say, you know what, let's not go to war, you know, let's sit down and you take Bactria, I take India, you take Macedonia, I take Egypt. And we kind of have like, you know, this, you know, an alliances that kind of works. When we're going to war, we're going to use together, but, you know, stuff like that. So, and it looks like local
Who is
population.
the enemy? Who is the enemy of this empire? They
There's always going to be,
they're gonna
enemies,
eat each other.
Gauls, you know, Illyrians. You can find, you can make up enemies.
There's a counterfactual here. If Alexander had survived another 10 or 20 years, it's hard to see the empire just being eaten up. I agree with Greg. Who would have, if Alexander were alive and all the generals were loyal to him with their military experience, who was there who would have taken any part of it away from them? I mean, it may have just been bad luck that Alexander died. I mean, it was charismatic leadership. They won this empire in 12 years, unlike the Romans. It wasn't done over centuries. It would have been quite possible for Alexander, I think, if he had 10 or 20 or 30 more years, to have sort of backfilled the empire and more Hellenized it and put in more administrative structures. It seems, you know, the Romans put, you know, they created military colonies and they granted land to their veterans and all the conquered provinces. That really managed to stick for a long time. The other thing about the Greeks, they weren't, I have the strong impression, Greek language, for example, I don't think got outside of the cities. It was used as an administrative language, but it never penetrated to the peasantry, to the natives anywhere except Anatolia. In the rest of the empire, Greek was a totally foreign language to them, to the great mass of the population. You know, it's an interesting question. How many Iranians learned Greek? I mean, we don't know.
Some of the Egyptians did. I mean, Ptolemy Ptolemy ran his operation very different from the other Diadochi. What Ptolemy did was he would basically send Greeks to basically take over native people's houses. So you can imagine that you had a house and all of a sudden this Greek moves in and he now is taking over your house and you've become his servant. That's what Ptolemy did. So, you know, in that situation, people, you know, did learn some Greek, though they didn't become very friendly to the Greeks.
But he turned out to be a good administrator in addition to be a good general. And that's very rare combination, you know, so, but this is like newly created empire. You know, the empires that created very fast, expanded tremendously in a very short period of time.
Antigonus also was a good administrator, and I'm going to talk about that in a couple of weeks. But Antigonus also, you know, was a good organizer, good administrator.
I'm just saying, like an example, for instance, in the Roman Empire, when Trajan expanded it like so fast and so much, you know, they got lucky that the next one, Adrian, was the one who was concentrated specifically, was also administrative genius, and who realized that, you know, you need to contract a little bit and control and create institutions and stabilize, and that gave impetus to the Roman Empire. It just, they were lucky that there was such a great succession, you know, but here it's, I mean, in Persian Empire, again, as I said, you know, Cyrus, you know, started expanding. It was great, all this stuff. But then Darius came and he created an incredible structure, administrative. He created the satrapies. Yeah.
one thing is though, he didn't create Mesopotamia had administration going already. You know, we had Hammurabi laws.
I
So
understand
you're not,
the same thing.
everything is flowing. So now Greeks came, and in fact, I could argue that Greeks were more admired in Egypt than Persians. And you
Yeah,
cannot
I
deny that.
agree.
Yeah, yeah, of
And
course.
you cannot
The,
deny that.
The Persians were hated in
Yeah.
Egypt.
Correct.
Alexander
So-
was welcomed when he visited.
Right, because he was welcome as the freedom giver. He was
He's a
welcome as
liberator.
to liberate them from the Persian oppression.
Actually,
That's the-
taking on another tack, when you think about it, you have this big empire. When all the different generals start fighting each other, why didn't anybody? I mean, the Gauls invaded over here, the Celts, I guess, but
Yes.
nobody invaded here. Why didn't Chandra Gupta take advantage of it and move in? Who was up here? Why didn't they come down?
That's where the Greek kingdoms were, in Bactria.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
not up here.
Greco-Bactria. But by the way,
this was the Roman
Chandragupta, his center is way to the east from here. We don't even see Pataliputra. It's a little further to the. It was a big
Yeah,
territory.
it's down right
It's
there.
hard for him. No. It's a north. It's closer to the mountains. It's closer to the mountains, but it's more to the east. So it was it was the outskirts of his empire, like a very far removed from the center. It was very hard for him to expand here.
Hmm.
You know,
And it was sparsely populated, and India was densely populated. I mean, it's kind of like, why? You know,
Yeah, well-
why go into those remote places?
But when a large power center starts to fragment, you expect people to take advantage of it. I mean, it's the Roman West.
Yeah, I think it's like when this new kind of tribe, I mean, not new, but the Parthians, when the Parthians
Yeah.
started to gain the momentum. I mean, they're the ones who wanted to claim the Persia, and of course conquered a lot of this territory, and including
but
Mesopotamia.
one idea, this might be wrong, and I might get attacked for it, but I almost feel like Alexander the Great was not interested in one person having this whole empire after he dies. And he might have had a division within his generals intentionally because he's just going to be the only one uniting. If there was a squirrel going on between two generals, he's the one as a mafia boss kind of putting it all together, putting the
How old was Alexander when he died?
He was like 33.
33 years old. So he
He's
he
like
was
really-
still a young man, and young people think that they're invulnerable, especially Alexander, who thought that he was a god. So probably, he never thought much about the succession because he didn't think he could die.
Yeah,
but
that's
how,
right.
what
I
was
don't
the
think
life
he.
expectancy at the time?
And administration, he didn't think about administration. He was thinking about like, who else am I going to fight with?
Right.
I mean, he was into that mode. I mean, yeah, it's all somehow will do. I mean, he wasn't that much.
Well, Alexander, it's interesting. Alexander resisted marriage to a large extent. It's speculated as to why, but I mean, it seems odd that a Macedonian.
homosexual.
Oh yeah, but that he needed a dynastic marriage. I mean, Philip was too, but he never took care of the dynastic issues. I mean, and the question is why.
Well,
nobody-
probably because he died at 33. I mean,
But what? If you have to go back farther, I mean, how old was Alexander when Philip died? Philip could have forced him into marriage.
Maybe no, it was on 20, so he's 20.
He was,
So Philip could have been.
Maybe he also didn't like the fact that Philip left a mess. He had a brother
Yeah.
that was alive, and he kind of sprayed his sperm everywhere. Really,
Yeah, well,
Philip-
they all
Yeah,
did.
yeah.
I mean,
he had
No,
a,
that was one of the big differences. That was one of the reasons that the Greeks were contemptuous of the Macedonians, because the Macedonians had a polygamy. Right.
By the way,
Yeah.
Alexander, as soon as he came to power, he killed his cousin right away. I
Right.
mean,
Yeah.
so he took care of this.
And
There
he
was
would
no
have
more
killed
danger.
Aridaeus, but Aridaeus was in some way mentally
Yeah,
defective, is the way they put
yeah,
it.
that's right. They didn't think of him, but his cousin, the the son of Perdiccas, that Philip decided that I'll leave him alone because he was a baby and he can just decided like no problem. You know, he was like, I don't know, maybe 14 or 15 by that time. And Alexander came to power. The first thing he did, he killed him.
Yeah, but it seems odd that Alexander didn't get into, you know, child producing sooner than with Roxanne.
Well, he did have, he had an illegitimate son named Heracles by a Persian woman named Barzina,
Yes,
who he never acknowledged.
that was his first.
Did you also marry Darius?
Yes, the Stagira. I don't know how you pronounce it.
Statera.
Statera. Yeah,
Statera.
that's right. And she also had a son.
So one of the reasons he didn't want to,
They just killed him right away.
he didn't want a Macedonian woman because he felt like he could use his marriage to kind of put his stamp in, you know, in Bactria and Persia. And the marriages of those times were common, that was used by kings and queens to gain land or gain favor of tribal leaders and stuff like that. Could be that the fact. I mean, and if he would have had a Macedonian wife, who would have, you know, I don't know what was the fact. He just didn't want to mess with that kind of, you know, you wanted to conquer the lands by, you know, marrying women from other lands to show them, listen, I am the king of kings, you know, and that's it basically. I just married.
It's kind of a tangent. I remember there's a wonderful movie. Paul can mention Game of Thrones. I can mention this. There's a wonderful movie, Kind Hearts and Coronets, starring Alec Guinness, which came out in the late 40s. Yeah, you have to be a certain age, I think. But the plot is that there's this inheritance, and there's a guy who is in the family, but he's 7 steps away from getting to the inheritance. So he decides to murder all the people between him and the inheritance sequentially. And the joke of the movie is that Alec Guinness plays every single role. But it sort of sounds like this. He just moves. In order to win, you have to just keep killing the competitors.
and it kind of like what Alexander the Great did, right? I mean, also in a way, not 7 steps, but there was a couple of steps to get to the.
I mean, the Alec Guinness movie was a comedy. Let's just
Well, this has a comic aspect. I mean, not for the participants, but.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying, like, he was a really smart man, right? To go this far, almost getting, you know, to the sea that he wanted to. You can't be stupid, you know, like, and for him not to think of succession, it's almost, for me, is unheard of. I mean, you know, I just don't understand. I mean, his advisors probably have told him, listen, at some point, you know, we have to. I think it was, you know, premeditated, where he didn't want his generals to be united, so they won't rebel against him, and therefore he kept them disunited. And then when everything went to shit, then he died, and they easily said, "Oh, we don't like each other. We were fighting amongst each other because we had a great leader, but he was divide and conquer." You know, kind of like what Putin is doing right now. You know,
I mean, one question is, to what extent did Alexander really believe that he was divine or semi-divine or something like that? To what extent did he really buy into the idea that he was different from everybody else around him, that he had a special relationship to the gods?
It's pretty clear as he moved east.
That no normal human being would do.
Well, the fact that he was so keen on adopting Persian practices, the Shah was not
it's almost
divine
like
precisely, but
in a Troy, when you know, Hector's father, you know, King Priam, you know, asks him, listen, you know, you have to believe in God. We can't march on, you know, on Greeks. And he goes, you know, how many battalions does Zeus command? You know, because he was practical. You know, how many battalions that God? So he must have been more practical as well, not just believing in.
Well, but look at this idea of trying to, you know, force all of his generals to marry Persian women, and trying to bring together and put these two people who'd been hostile for hundreds of years. And, you know, the Greeks, you know, referred to the Persians as barbarians. And he had the chutzpah to think that he could meld them together.
Yeah, he admired
just on his own will.
I think is like Hitler. I think as long as Alexander kept winning, no general would challenge him. If he started to
Exactly,
lose,
that's one point, exactly.
if he started to lose, then the charisma would
Yeah.
start to dwindle.
Yeah.
I mean,
Exactly. He knew
What-
that. And how many times they tried to challenge him? He killed his, one of his
Yeah.
major, generals in India because the guy said, "What the fuck are we doing? Where are we going?
yeah.
Where are you taking us?"
All right, well, he
But
killed
it's very
Titus
easy
the
to
Black.
feel divine in his shoes. I mean, you get
It's-
intoxicated with power so fast.
And he
Well,
had
it's pretty
You've
clear he
got such
did.
a success.
As he went east, he got more divine. I
And
mean,
he had what would seem to be some sort of, mystical experience in Egypt, in Siwa,
Yeah.
where the Egyptians
Right.
who were,
Yeah, they
the
they claimed him
pharaonic
divine.
Egyptians who were masters of religious mumbo jumbo, basically put over on Alexander that he was the son of Zeus, and he ran with it. He bought it.
Yeah.
Well, the religious aspect was pretty important for him, right? I think last time we talked about like the siege of Tyre, right? Where he decided to siege the city because it wouldn't let him sacrifice to Heracles. Well, like it actually wasn't Heracles. So Tyre had a god called Melkart, and basically why he wanted to sacrifice inside the city is because like Tyre had a priest king. So they wouldn't let him sacrifice because if they did, Alexander would become the priest king. So his idea was being a priest king, kind of that religious aspect was really important for him.
And by the way, Melkar later became Hercules
Right.
through this.
Okay. I guess where is Zach? We got to wrap it up, I think. So,
Yeah, this was really amazing, John. Thank you. And
Yeah.
I just
Thank
want
you.
to
Really
remind
good job. You really catalyzed a great discussion. Thank you.
Yep.
remind everybody that that we have 3 presentations next week. Jewish nature, history of wine and winemaking, and on Sunday we have the Atsekas, rise and fall of Atsekas show. So it's 3 different contrasts, and then and then the week after that we'll continue on the Greek path again. So appreciate everyone, and I'll talk to you if you guys join Wednesday, Thursday, and Sunday. If not, whenever. And I appreciate it. Thanks for support, and thanks, John, again. This was amazing.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yes. Thank you, John.
So long, everybody. Have a good week.
Yes.
Yeah.